At the time that I was heading here, I thought 5 hours would be a real stretch, and concentration would falter and things would drag, and it's been quite the opposite. We are panel 3, placed after the middle, I like to think, and what's been interesting for me in preparing for this panel, speaking to all 3 of the panelists, is that I had several terms or propositions or questions written down, and so many of those have come up in the first half of the seminar. The other thing I wanted to comment about, because it's come up a few times, not meant as a threat to my panelists, is this question of 12 minutes. I know that there has been a bit of back and forth discussion about this, and I was actually quite excited by the challenge that the sort of durational aspect of a presentation holds. In some ways, for artists, and Nancy spoke, and of course Jatish also curates, but for artists to speak of their work in 12 minutes is to think through editing, think very, very conceptually, but also think against excess. Something that I think in terms of, in the classic mode of installation art, we have come to expect as an experiential mode, that of excess. So the panel's titled Immersive and Temporal, and as with the other panels, I'm not going to waste time introducing the panelists because I think everybody here is familiar with their practice, and I think the projects that they will be presenting as well. Immersive and temporal. In all the panels, for me, both of these terms lie at the heart of what we have come to understand as installation, and now in heavy quotes, the access of space and time. And many of the presentations that we've seen or heard so far have delved into this in varied ways. So how do we think of the installation not as form, not as media, nor moored to a particular site, but as Geeta's title for the seminar indicates, spatially? And unlike the previous panels, I would suggest that installation not be framed by time and space, but on the contrary, a refusal to be framed by the idea of distance and duration. We have an intergenerational panel, and I mean this in the best way possible: Sheba, Chhachhi, Sonia, Khurana, and Pallavi, Paul. And for me, this is significant. All 3, for me, have a very strong feminist practice. And they represent, in a sort of way, a tentative sort of feminist trajectory of installation practice in India. And even as their presentations will underline the limitations of this term as a noun, as we've come to this point so far. So how does the aspect of time appear as form? How is it experienced? And this is something that Indar gestured towards in his comment that he made about entering or immersing oneself in something.
And desire.
Is it a suspension of historical or a temporary forgetting of biological time that Jatish had mentioned? And in the comments after panel 1, again, chronos and kairos came up. So a momentary experience of kairos, a heightened suspension of chronological time. But again, speaking to the presentations that will follow, how does the subconscious experience time or space? How is history immersed in space or time when it is opaque? How are historical time and mythic time collapsed in a spatial construct? I'd like to reiterate some terms and words, most of which have now come up through the day. So one, of course, is opacity, and I know that Pallavi will be speaking about that. But opacity as a method, the act of hiding or making invisible. On the one hand, it implies an erstwhile presence of visibility, and then a conscious effort to render that hidden. In a PhD Viva presentation yesterday, somebody spoke not of absences, but of blindness. Can opacity in historical moments be thought of as blindness to something? Nancy's proposition of Ched Bhed, which was absolutely fantastic, again, the idea of a secret or the unconscious, not even the subconscious, but the unconscious. But simultaneously, the subconscious as illegibility and history as opacity. The idea of folding, which is also part of Sonia's title, making opaque, but in the act of folding, making materially and conceptually dense as you keep folding. Language as code. How is this communicated? How does, and Pallavi will talk about this at length as well, the illegibility of language. And then Gayatri spoke of the brutality of the present, of the now. So from the political to the poetic, and all three of these presentations will speak to that, about how can this brutality be made legible or, in fact, coded through poetics or form. Installative propositions, which is, I think, my favorite sort of alternative to installation art that's come up, but installative propositions that don't make truth claims. Speaking of the viewer, the spectator, I'm not sure about using the word participant out here. Is it an act of submersion or immersion? It is a corporeal experience through the sensorium, which is one of the sort of distinctive points of installative propositions or installation art for me. Performativity. How can a space be made to perform? But this also begs the question about how still images or words, as these presentations have been doing, may represent or speak of what, at least in these presentations, is a sensorial experience. Or what one inhabits installatively. That's something else that somebody had said earlier. And I know that when Sheba and I were speaking, she had thought of not showing any images, and I said, Sheba, show at least one as an image up there. And she said no, because I can't, and she very correctly pointed out that in speaking of the immersive experience, as the case may be, the one iconic image as a still image up there would do further disservice to understanding or to unpacking what we're trying to do. So just as you must move through, whether through language, through the act of speaking, so must we also then make do with still images to move through the presentations. And with that, I'll ask Sheba to perhaps present first.
I'm going to take you on a walk, a descent really, an itinerary that moves through a fairly large space. Stay with me. Dowsing Delhi, seeking out memories and histories of water that murmur beneath her crowded streets. It was while walking through the sites of the 48 Degrees project in the northern and central parts of the city, absorbing details of their layered history, that I realized how much of what we stand on, gaze at, was once water. From the dried up lake of Roshanara Bagh to the teeming thoroughfare outside Old Delhi railway station, today's dry, dusty, polluted and fraught urbanscape shimmers and dissolves into waterways and water bodies of less than a few hundred years ago. On a chaotic pavement facing the railway station, like a misbeat, stands the Delhi Public Library, a late colonial building. At the entrance is a small plaque commemorating the inauguration of a swimming pool in 1934. Moving past the main library sections down a nondescript corridor through a small, easily overlooked doorway, the smell of a mausoleum. And in the flicker of a dying tube light, bulging out from the wall, a lion's head, stone jaws agape, dead eyes staring into mounds of debris, an erstwhile fountain choked with old newspapers, dry and dead for over 60 years. A short flight of stairs leads down into a huge vault, the floor sloping down to the far end. A high ceiling, windows caked with grime through which appear glimpses of the moving feet of library users. Piled high with rotting papers, bundles of books tied with string, broken furniture, decaying mattresses, tangled bits of electrical wire, abandoned files. This is the swimming pool, discovered by accident, serendipity. A wide range of materials, scientific, historical, mythological, coalesce in this strange underground cavern. A map of Shahjahanabad, circa 1830, shows waterways and gardens on the exact site where we are standing. Stories of the river goddess Yamuna, replete with transgressive desire, medieval miniature paintings recording the lives that flourished along her banks, reports of the incursion of a non-native fish, tilapia, which flourishes in toxicity, and the disappearance of the dolphins. Trolling the waters of history and cultural memory, entering layers of time that mark the site, the sense of lost epistemologies grows critical. The focus, of course, is the crisis around water and the river. Black water flows out of the reactivated fountain pouring from the lion's mouth. Desiccated tilapia perch on its rim. The sound of falling water permeates the space. Black water, blue light, transform the subterranean repository of residues. Deacquisition books, whole bodies of knowledge tied into bundles with string, are now just paper waste, ready to be pulped. Truckloads are added to the pool, creating teetering walls and cliff-like forms, a craggy book geoscape. The book bundle becomes the basic sculptural unit of the installation. Book-shaped light boxes glow between the stacks, carrying pre-modern riverine images, tropes that are extant, the sensuality of gopis bathing in the river, in a 16th century miniature painting, manifest in Bollywood images of heroines bathing, just as the ascetic on the riverbank, the singer, the river goddess, Krishna and Balram, continue to appear in popular culture along with their attendant stories. Here they are brought into uneasy chiasmus with the degraded, trash-strewn present of the river, as well as aerial photographs of the numerous dams that reduce her waters as she descends from the mountains. Recuperating ideas and images from the abundant, active symbology of water articulated within the multiple cultures of the city of Delhi, the conceptualizing of water ranges from the materiological to the mythopoetic, the religious to the mercantile. Seeds of eco-philosophy surface despite commodified religious and ritual uses of water, illuminating knowledge systems that could generate material acts of conservation and regeneration. A deep blue light saturates the space. Every object, every architectural element, every person takes on the hue. Each person within the space is altered, rendered strange. We become spectral traces within this archive of traces, tracking the sedimentation of time and memory, through the colonial back to the Mughal and the pre-Mughal period. To calibrate an imaginary psychogeography of water, time-based media, both visual and auditory, transform the exclusions of the official archive into an immersive experience, building a pool of intimacy in the midst of one of the most crowded areas of the city. Visitor participants, and I do use the word participant, range from regular library users, artists, ecologists, to passers-by, travelers, and street urchins. The archive is transformed into a sensorium, a space where known images, timeframes, and objects are defamiliarized, denaturalized, perhaps destabilized, in a series of sensorial and temporal encounters. My concern with time goes beyond evoking the historical or even the mythological to creating a visceral encounter with the simultaneous coexistence of multiple temporalities. The immersive installation calls upon the whole body, training attention on the gap between conventional constructs of time, eliciting sensations that are physical, emotional, and psychological. The artwork turns into an instrument, akin to the forked rod used by water diviners to sense the presence of water deep below the surface of the earth, a diachronic, synchronic receptor enabling the reading of subterranean histories and mythologies of water below the city's dense surfaces. Each visitor is invited to become a water diviner. Arising from this work, arising from the water diviner, yet going beyond it, I would like to flag certain key concepts which are integral to my practice and may be useful to our discussion today, though many of them have already manifested in the morning. Sight, site-specific, co-creating with sight, producing sight. I'm making distinctions here to further inflect the discussion of the morning. Installation as a site of contemplation, critical reflection, a think space, a chintan mandal. Archive, material, immaterial, trace, historical, imaginary, mythological. Embodied viewing, and for me this is one of the most critical aspects of what I do and what I seek to do. The sensorium, moving beyond the tyranny of eye and ear, image and sound, towards sentience, towards creating environment, experience, involving the entire sensorial capacity of the body. Drawing on theatre rather than cinema, seeking to alter spectatorial relationships. Synesthesia, synergy of light, sound, image, space. Hypnagogic processes between sleep and waking, associative, interconnected. Multiple epistemologies, multiple temporalities, transformation. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sheba. Hypnagogic, what a word, what a beautiful word. So yeah, I mean, since we all have 12 minutes, I thought what else to do but to speak about the whole world in 12 minutes. And the work is going to only be a brief encounter in that larger dialogue of the whole world. The somewhat provocative title, though, of my presentation, To Change Your Language, You Must Change Your Life, is borrowed from Derek Walcott's 1965 poem titled Codicil. It seemed like the appropriate weave to fold in some of the thoughts that I bring to share today. This poem addresses quite directly questions of amnesia and violence. Walcott, however, never visits these ideas through nostalgia for another time. His visitations are refracted via the pressing urgency of the now. It is this now, the now of memory, but also simultaneously the now of erasure, which I provisionally deploy as the contemporary. In a piece titled What is a Creative Act?, Gilles Deleuze says about ideas, and I quote, he says, "Ideas have to be treated like potentials already engaged in one mode of expression, inseparable from that mode of expression, such that I cannot say that I have an idea in general," unquote. He's using idea as almost a very pointed form. What Deleuze is suggesting then is that the potential of thought is indistinguishable from its material context. This flattening of the distinction between thought and material, which is perhaps the fundamental radical suggestion of his work, can help us enter into the specific arrangement that I suggest for this presentation. Here, I am setting up the contemporary in relationship to documentary. Documentary, in my practice, works as the atmosphere where certain strategies can be enabled. Instead of having a declarative relationship to archives, publics, and images, it can be taken as the malleable material onto which everydayness, repetitions, differences, banality, power, wonder can be mapped. The question I prompt here is, what does the viewing of the contemporary through the lens of the documentary even enable or produce? Why must even it be done? And in typical Deleuzian fashion, I will also attempt to answer my own question. I suggest that we witness today the double pull of truth. Even as we are flooded with images, questions about their veracity are getting simultaneously amplified. The document within this climate has reassumed its charge in the theaters of justice and violence. The choreography of materials is now as pressing as their readings. Anything can be a document now. Trace, gesture, memory, body, voice, and therefore everything is implicated within the mode of documentary. Now, to give you a quick context of the images that you see, these are photographic portraits of Playfair code cards, which I found in the National Archives in London. I chanced upon them when I was researching espionage histories, and more specifically, a secret agent called Noor Inayat Khan. The Playfair cipher, as is now widely known, contributed to the victory of the Allied forces in World War II. This was because it replaced the Enigma. Enigma was a coding method used by the German forces, based primarily on permutations and combinations. The Playfair, on the other hand, used single individual keys for each transmitter. This meant that each secret agent had his or her own unique key, a key which was a word or a phrase they believed they could commit to memory forever. Only the home station would have a copy of this phrase, and hence it was the only place where the message could be decoded. To capture a secret agent became a useless act then, because the key led nowhere. I urge you to see closely the various enmeshed networks of visibility and opacity here. Each phrase chosen by the cipher maker resonates both as a key to confidential information, but also as a mindscape, a diary entry, a confession, a memory, a hope, a promise, or even an incantation. In making portraits of these cards, I'm also pushed to think about the claim to visibility. I use the term claim for its restlessness. A claim has to always be made. It is always in construction, almost levitating in the zone between true and false. A claim may exist independent of evidence, but also in the absence of the claim, the truth has no public force. The truth must always be claimed. When I begin to hear its suggestions, the material comes alive with a violent kind of force. The thicker the information, the more obscure is the body. The success of the secret agent depends on the extent of their invisibility. There's a beautiful dialogue in a Hindi film called Talash, where a character is a ghost, and this ghost is talking to a person who doesn't know that it's a ghost. The conversation is about disappearance, and this ghost says, "Jo hai hi nahi, wo gayab kaise ho sakte hain? How can the invisible disappear?" Code then is both the trace of this invisibility, but also a form of generative opacity. It becomes the precipice from which the assumptions about documentary, and dare I say the whole world, can be challenged. I turn to the Caribbean philosopher Edward Glissant, who is my current crush, and I'm obsessed and gripped by him, to populate this idea of opacity and its connections to the rhythms of truth, indexicality, and poetics. I'd urge you to read this, and I can read it aloud as well. Opacity is not derangement. It has its own transparency, not imposed, which one must know how to deserve to feel. A shifting play of archipelagos, where each relation in the first place expands and becomes clear. Opacity welcomes and collects the mystery and the obvious of all poetics. That is to say, all details of the places of the world without ever offending them and without trying to reduce them one at a time. To think then about truth and documentary as a shadow of the world brings us to the question of light. If thought in terms of the laws of physics, a light echo is a phenomena caused by light reflected off surfaces distant from the source and arriving at the observer with a delay. Because of their geometries, light echoes can produce the illusion of superluminal speeds. There is inbuilt into the question of light and echo the question of time. To locate within this configuration the idea of the archive is imperative to thinking about shared knowledge and its relationship to power. It also takes me back to the beginning of the story about chancing upon these cards in a state archive. The lag between these objects bearing national memory in a state institution to becoming porous accounts of individual vulnerabilities and triumphs becomes the fertile gap from which art is made possible. This is an instance where I installed these cards at Jorbagh in an art venue in Delhi, where I was actually trying to use light both as a cushioning surface but also as a cohesive material in addition to the text on these cards, and in addition to think about how code information, the fold of documentary can actually speak to ideas of visibility, transparency, and of course light. Here I'd also like to briefly talk about two other connected works. As I mentioned, in the same period that I was working my way through these cards, I was also looking at the personal files of Noor Inayat Khan. Noor Inayat Khan, very quickly to give you a backdrop, is a descendant of Tipu Sultan, whose resistance to British colonialism is, of course, very well documented. Owing to a complex set of circumstances, Noor finds herself enrolled as an SOE agent and working for the British during World War II. And this is the reason that she is absent, virtually absent from all Indian history, because it is not convenient for Tipu Sultan's descendant to be spying for the British in the World War II. And she's also kind of absent from British history, largely marginalized in British history, because she's not British. So her official file then becomes the only document of her life, albeit an unreliable one. Because when I began to read it, it reads like a dystopic science fiction document. There are multiple official accounts of her death and disappearance. A crime had occurred, but there was no dead body, no murder weapon, no crime scene, no time of death, and no identifiable criminals. The only document available then is the story itself, the claim, always in the making, always communicated without a hint of doubt. The challenge to this form of power was staged in this work through the use of Morse code. Morse code is, of course, as we know, a machinic language, now in use for over 100 years. And it's a system of converting alphabets into procedural signs. Signals comprise of dots and dashes, pronounced as dit and da, respectively. An offshoot of the telegraph system, the Morse can be thought of as a data compression mechanism. The underlying principle is that unnecessary information must be erased in order to transfer information effectively. This creates a constant tension between efficiency and truth. The mechanism of this language reads almost like an allegory to the files of the secret agents I found in the National Archives. What also makes the use of Morse interesting is that this is a language meant to be enunciated only by machines and to be read by humans. So what I do in this work is that this long object, which is a 75-foot scroll, has bits of her file inscribed both as text but also transcribed into Morse code. And so this right now it's installed in this picture at the Beirut Art Center. It was installed almost as a sculptural piece that you could walk through, but it is also used as a performance object where multiple people or a single performer reads aloud the entries of these files in Morse, except when read in Morse, the entries sound like gibberish because you are only saying dit, da, 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 dit, dit, dit. And what happens is when read collectively, it almost produces the experience of a soundscape, which is quite precise in the information that it's conveying and yet sounds like complete cacophony and gibberish. And when you read it by yourself, you are also able to see what this kind of double pull of information is. In making the body, the premise for the sonic enunciation, in which the word masquerades as a note, and I mean note both as a musical note as well as a record. And in linking the mechanical to the sensual, what I'm trying to do is to pull at the entrails of this marginalia, where more is to be erased for more to be seen. So this is a close-up of what it actually looks like. So there's text and then there's Morse. And having started from documentary, legibility, truth, and transparency, I finally leave you in the custody of the secret. How must one think about secrets? What is it that can be said about them? Can revelations dethrone secrets? There are quite a few events that do not leave even a written trace, but everything else must pass through paper at least once. In this work, which was installed as a carpet, which was spread across about 4,000 square feet, the word secret is woven into the carpet and appears as a leitmotif, as a recurrence. And even as it becomes the ground on which we walk, it refrains from becoming a fixed location or a recognizable place. It is surrounded by the pressures of changing words around it, and therefore sometimes becomes a sensation and at others a system. At once a parting provocation and a comforting promise, the secret alerts us to the possibilities and the dangers of truth. Thank you.